I always knew my mother-in-law Victoria would find some way to remind everyone at Sunday dinner that I didn't belong at the Blackwood family table, but I never imagined she'd look me dead in the eye and call me worthless in front of 20 relatives, while my husband sat there in stunned silence. Sometimes the most devastating moments come served alongside roast beef and pretentious wine pairings. What happened next didn't just change that dinner, it shattered every assumption the Blackwood family had about bloodlines, worth, and who really belonged in their precious legacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, cream-colored paper with the Blackwood family crest embossed in gold. Another monthly family dinner at the estate. Another evening of carefully orchestrated reminders that I would never measure up to their standards. I held the elegant cardstock between my fingers, feeling the weight of expensive paper that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Another command performance, I muttered to myself, setting the invitation on our kitchen counter next to the stack of unpaid bills that seemed to grow taller each week. My name was printed in perfect calligraphy. Ms. Emma Chen-Blackwood and Mr. David Blackwood. Even after 3 years of marriage, Victoria still couldn't bring herself to acknowledge that I had taken their precious family name. David emerged from our bedroom, adjusting his tie for another day at the law firm where he worked as a junior associate. Despite being a Blackwood, he had chosen to forge his own path rather than join the family's real estate empire, a decision that had created an ongoing tension with his mother. He kissed my cheek absently while scanning his phone for messages. "Another dinner invitation from your mother," I said, holding up the card, complete with the usual subtle reminder that I'm not really family. David glanced at the invitation and sighed. "She means well, Em. The family dinners are tradition. Grandmother Evelyn started them 50 years ago." "Your grandmother never made me feel like hired help at my own wedding," I pointed out, remembering the passive-aggressive comments Victoria had made throughout our reception about my quaint family background and modest dress choice. "She sees me as the interloper who corrupted her perfect son." David's expression softened with familiar guilt. He had witnessed enough of these subtle attacks over the years to know they weren't figments of my imagination, yet he always seemed paralyzed when it came to confronting his mother directly. Maybe this time will be different. I almost laughed at his optimism. David Blackwood, brilliant attorney who could argue complex cases in front of federal judges, became a nervous schoolboy whenever his mother raised her perfectly sculpted eyebrow in disapproval. His entire family had that effect on him, the weight of generations of success and expectation pressing down like an invisible hand. After David left for work, I sat in our small apartment, a converted loft in an up-and-coming neighborhood that we could barely afford on his associate's salary, and thought about the woman I had been before I became a Blackwood wife. Emma Chen, daughter of immigrants who owned a small restaurant in Chinatown. First-generation college graduate with a degree in social work. Someone who believed that worth was measured by kindness and contribution, not by the size of your trust fund or the age of your family name. 3 years ago, I had been confident in my own skin, proud of my heritage, and certain that love could bridge any gap between different worlds. Now, I spent Sunday afternoons getting dressed for family dinners, like I was preparing for battle, carefully selecting outfits that might meet Victoria's unspoken standards while trying not to lose myself completely in the process. The Blackwood family gathered monthly at Willowbrook Estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been in the family for 4 generations. The house sat on 20 acres of manicured grounds in the most exclusive suburb of the city, surrounded by other estates belonging to families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. It was the kind of place where servants still existed, where dinner was served rather than eaten, and where conversations revolved around charity galas and investment portfolios. David had grown up in this world of privilege and expectation, though he had always felt somewhat outside of it due to his preference for public service over private wealth accumulation. His decision to become a prosecutor rather than join Blackwood Properties had been seen as a youthful rebellion that the family tolerated with barely concealed disappointment. Meeting and marrying me had been viewed as the second phase of his extended adolescent rebellion. Victoria Blackwood ruled this empire with the iron fist of someone who had married into wealth and then spent 30 years proving she belonged there. Born Victoria Palmer, daughter of a middle-class insurance salesman, she had transformed herself into the perfect society matriarch through sheer force of will and careful study of upper-class behavior. Her own humble origins made her even more ruthless in maintaining the family's elevated status, as if any crack in the facade might reveal her as the imposter she secretly believed herself to be. I knew none of this history when David first brought me home to meet his family. All I saw was a woman who looked at me like I was a stain on her Persian rug, someone who spoke in honeyed tones while delivering surgical strikes to my confidence. It took months of these encounters before I began to understand that Victoria's hostility wasn't personal. It was territorial. I represented everything she feared, proof that the Blackwood mystique could be penetrated by an outsider, that their carefully constructed world wasn't as exclusive as they pretended. The Sunday before the latest dinner invitation, I had made the mistake of mentioning my parents' restaurant during cocktail hour. Victoria had smiled her practiced smile and said, "How charming that your family is in the service industry. David has always had such a generous heart when it comes to helping those less fortunate." The comment had been delivered with surgical precision, managing to diminish both my family's business and my marriage in a single sentence. David's father, Robert Blackwood, was a different kind of challenge altogether. Where Victoria was actively hostile, Robert was passively dismissive. He had a talent for looking through me during conversations, as if I were transparent. When forced to acknowledge my presence, he spoke to me the way one might address a child or a particularly slow service worker, with exaggerated patience and simple vocabulary. Robert had built Blackwood Properties into a regional powerhouse through a combination of inherited capital and ruthless business acumen. He owned shopping centers, office buildings, and residential developments throughout 3 states. The family wealth was substantial enough that none of them actually needed to work, though they all maintained various professional roles to avoid the stigma of being seen as idle rich. The extended family was equally challenging in their own ways. David's sister Catherine worked as a curator at the city's premier art museum, a position that had been gifted to her through family connections rather than earned through merit. She treated me with the benevolent condescension of someone who considered herself culturally sophisticated, often making comments about ethnic cuisine or asking if I had tried authentic Chinese food since moving to America. The fact that I was born in San Francisco and had never lived anywhere else seemed to escape her notice entirely. David's cousin Marcus ran the charitable foundation arm of the family business, which gave him endless opportunities to pontificate about helping the less fortunate, while simultaneously looking down on anyone who actually was less fortunate. He had a particular talent for turning every conversation into a lecture about proper grateful behavior from charity recipients, somehow managing to make it clear that I should feel thankful for being allowed into their elevated circle. The younger generation of Blackwoods wasn't much better. David's nephew Trevor, Catherine's son, was a 22-year-old trust fund baby who had never worked a day in his life but felt qualified to offer career advice to anyone who would listen. His sister Sophia was finishing her senior year at an Ivy League university, majoring in art history and minoring in making pointed comments about people who married up in society. Every family gathering was a carefully choreographed reminder of my outsider status. Conversations would shift to topics I couldn't contribute to: vacations in the Hamptons, private school memories, mutual friends from their exclusive social circle. When I did attempt to participate, my comments would be met with polite smiles and subtle redirections back to subjects where I had no experience or knowledge. The week leading up to this particular dinner had been especially difficult. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David was working on a high-profile case that required long hours and weekend preparation, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that I was slowly disappearing under the weight of trying to become someone the Blackwoods might eventually accept. I had started avoiding phone calls from my own family, embarrassed by how much I had changed, how quiet I had become around David's relatives. My parents, Henry and Lynn Chen, had built their restaurant from nothing, working 18-hour days to provide for their children and create something lasting in their adopted country. They had raised me to be proud of our heritage, to value hard work and authenticity over appearances and status. Watching their daughter transform into someone who apologized for her background would have broken their hearts, which was why I had started making excuses to avoid family dinners on my side as well. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had become isolated from my own loving family in pursuit of acceptance from people who would never truly welcome me. David's relatives tolerated my presence because they had to, but they made sure I understood that tolerance wasn't the same as belonging. Every gathering reinforced the hierarchy. Every conversation reminded me that I was an addition to their family tree, not a natural part of it. Friday evening arrived with the weight of impending obligation. David came home from work looking exhausted, his usually perfect appearance slightly rumpled from another 14-hour day at the office. He dropped his briefcase by the door and loosened his tie, the universal signal that he was transitioning from lawyer mode to husband mode. "How was your day?" I asked, though I could read the answer in the tension around his eyes. "Morrison, case is going to trial next month," he said, rubbing his temples. "Partner thinks we have a strong chance, but the preparation is going to be brutal." He looked up at me with tired eyes. "Sorry I've been so absent lately. After this case wraps up, maybe we can take a weekend somewhere. Just the two of us." I wanted to tell him that what I really needed wasn't a weekend getaway, but his support during these family gatherings. I wanted to explain that his silence during his mother's attacks felt like abandonment, that his failure to defend me was slowly eroding my trust in our marriage. Instead, I smiled and asked if he wanted dinner. "Actually," he said, checking his watch, "I need to review some depositions tonight. Mind if we just order something quick?" This had become our pattern. David's career demands combined with his family obligations left little time for addressing the growing strain in our relationship. We coexisted like roommates, sharing space and expenses but rarely connecting on any deeper level. The passionate, idealistic couple who had fallen in love despite their different backgrounds had evolved into polite strangers who happened to share a last name. Saturday morning brought rain and the kind of gray sky that seemed to match my mood perfectly. I spent the day cleaning our apartment and trying to decide what to wear to Sunday's dinner. Every choice felt loaded with meaning. Too casual, and Victoria would make pointed comments about respect for family traditions. Too formal, and she would suggest I was trying too hard to impress people above my station. The perfect middle ground seemed to shift constantly, like trying to hit a moving target in the dark. David spent most of Saturday at the office, despite it being the weekend. His dedication to his career was admirable in theory, but in practice, it left me feeling like a single person who happened to be married. I found myself wondering what would happen if I simply didn't show up to the dinner. Would David even notice, or would he be too busy discussing legal precedents with his father? To register my absence? By Sunday afternoon, I had changed clothes 3 times and was contemplating claiming sudden illness to avoid the evening altogether. David returned from another morning at the office just as I was putting on my final outfit choice, a conservative navy dress that I hoped would be appropriate without being memorable. "You look beautiful," he said absently, scrolling through emails on his phone. "Ready to go?" The drive to Willowbrook Estate took 45 minutes through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods. David spent most of the journey on hands-free calls with colleagues, leaving me to stare out the window at houses that grew larger and more intimidating with each mile. By the time we pulled through the estate's iron gates, I felt like I was approaching a fortress where I would never truly belong. The circular driveway was already filled with luxury vehicles. Mercedes, BMWs, and Audis parked with the casual precision of people who had never worried about car payments or insurance. Premiums. David's modest sedan looked distinctly out of place among the automotive displays of wealth. Another reminder that even he occupied a somewhat diminished status within his own family hierarchy. Victoria answered the door herself, which meant the household staff had been given the evening off to maintain the illusion that this was an intimate family gathering rather than a performance. She wore a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her makeup applied with professional precision. "David, darling," she said, embracing her son with genuine warmth before turning to me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Emma, how lovely that you could join us." The subtle emphasis on could suggested that my attendance was optional rather than expected, a small but effective way of reinforcing my outsider status from the moment I walked through the door. I murmured appropriate pleasantries while David seemed oblivious to the underlying dynamics already at play. The Blackwood family had gathered in the formal living room, a space that looked like it had been designed more for photography than actual human habitation. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched from gilded frames, and furniture arranged in conversational clusters that somehow discouraged actual conversation. Robert stood near the fireplace, holding court with Marcus and Trevor about some business deal that would apparently benefit all of humanity while coincidentally making them even wealthier. Catherine perched on the edge of an antique sofa, discussing the museum's upcoming exhibition, with Sophia, who nodded along while checking her phone every few seconds. David's Aunt Margaret, Robert's sister, sat slightly apart from the others, observing the family dynamics with the bemused expression of someone who had learned to find entertainment in watching other people perform their roles. Margaret had never married, having dedicated her life to various humanitarian causes that took her to remote corners of the world. She was the family member I found most tolerable, perhaps because her extensive travel had given her perspective on how small their rarefied world actually was. "Emma, dear," Victoria called out, drawing everyone's attention to my arrival. "Come tell us about your little job. I understand you're still working with those troubled children downtown." The phrase "little job" landed like a small slap, reducing my career in social work to a hobby that I would presumably abandon once I came to my senses. Several family members turned toward me with expressions of polite interest, the kind of attention zoo visitors might pay to a mildly interesting exhibit. "I work with at-risk youth," I corrected gently. "Helping teenagers navigate family crises and educational challenges. It's actually quite rewarding work." "How admirable," Catherine chimed in with her practiced art world smile. "It must be so fulfilling to give back to the community, especially to people from backgrounds similar to your own." The comment was delivered with such subtle poison that it took a moment to fully register. Catherine had managed to suggest that my clients and I shared some kind of deficit background, that my work was a form of charity to my own kind rather than professional expertise applied to a social problem. David shifted uncomfortably beside me but said nothing. "Actually," I replied, keeping my voice level, "my clients come from all backgrounds. Poverty, abuse, and family dysfunction aren't limited to any particular ethnic or economic group." "Of course not," Victoria interjected, smoothly. "Though I imagine growing up in Chinatown gives you special insight into certain cultural challenges." I felt my face flush with the familiar combination of anger and helplessness that these conversations always produced. Every response felt like walking into a trap. If I corrected their assumptions, I would be accused of being oversensitive. If I remained silent, they would take my silence as confirmation of their prejudices. Margaret caught my eye from across the room and offered a nearly imperceptible eye roll that suggested she recognized the game being played. Her small gesture of solidarity helped me maintain my composure as the conversation mercifully shifted to other topics. Dinner was announced by the soft chime of a crystal bell, and we processed into the formal dining room like actors taking their places for a theatrical performance. The table was set with china that had been in the family for generations, crystal that caught the light from an enormous chandelier, and enough silverware to suggest that eating was a complex technical skill rather than a basic human function. My place card positioned me between Trevor and Marcus, while David was seated near his parents at the head of the table. This arrangement ensured that I would spend the evening listening to Trevor's theories about cryptocurrency investments and Marcus's lectures about effective philanthropy, while being too far from David to rely on his support for any meaningful conversations. The first course arrived without fanfare, presented by servers who moved through the room with practiced invisibility. Everything about the dinner was designed to reinforce hierarchy and tradition, from the formal service to the carefully orchestrated conversation topics that excluded anyone without the proper background knowledge. "Emma," Marcus said, turning his attention to me as we began eating, "I've been thinking about our foundation's youth programs. Perhaps you could share some insights about working with disadvantaged populations." The request sounded generous on the surface, but I recognized it as another performance. Marcus would listen to my response with apparent interest, then explain why my street-level experience, while touching, didn't align with the Foundation's more sophisticated approach to social problems. He had played this scene before with other outsiders who had briefly entered the family orbit. "I'd be happy to discuss effective intervention strategies," I replied carefully, though I should mention that many of the young people I work with wouldn't necessarily identify as disadvantaged. They're dealing with specific challenges, but they're also incredibly resourceful and resilient. Marcus nodded with the patronizing expression of someone humoring a well-meaning amateur. Of course. It's important to maintain their dignity. But surely you recognize that these children need guidance from people who understand how to navigate mainstream society successfully." They need support systems and opportunities," I corrected. "Most of them understand mainstream society perfectly well. They just don't have access to the same resources that make success easier to achieve." "Exactly," Marcus said, missing my point entirely. "Which is why the Foundation focuses on teaching proper values and work ethic. We can't simply throw money at these problems without addressing the underlying cultural issues." I felt my patience beginning to fray. Marcus was describing my clients as if they were an alien species requiring civilizing influence, rather than human beings facing systemic obstacles. His entire worldview was built on the assumption that poverty and struggle indicated some kind of moral failing rather than structural inequality. "Many of my clients work harder than anyone at this table," I said, my voice carrying more edge than I had intended. "They're often supporting families while attending school, dealing with housing instability, and navigating systems that weren't designed with their needs in mind. The idea that they lack work ethic is simply incorrect." A silence fell over the nearby conversations as my words registered. I had violated an unspoken rule by directly challenging one of the family members, by suggesting that their charitable assumptions might be wrong. Trevor looked up from his phone with sudden interest, sensing that something dramatic might be about to happen. Marcus's face flushed slightly, though he maintained his charitable expression. "I'm sure your personal attachment to these cases gives you a different perspective," he said carefully. "But those of us with broader experience in social policy understand that emotional involvement can sometimes cloud professional judgment." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable now. He had moved from patronizing my clients to patronizing me, suggesting that my education and professional experience were somehow invalidated by my emotional investment in the work. Around the table, I could see family members exchanging glances, sensing conflict brewing. Professional judgment based on what? I asked, no longer attempting to keep my voice level. Theoretical knowledge from people who have never actually worked with these populations? Research conducted by academics who return to their suburban homes every evening? Emma. David's voice carried a warning tone from across the table. Maybe we should move on to a different topic. But I was beyond caring about maintaining peace. Years of accumulated slights and dismissals had reached a breaking point, and Marcus's smug assumptions about my clients had pushed me past my ability to smile and deflect. No, David, I said, turning to look at my husband. I think this conversation is important. Your cousin seems to believe that throwing charity money at those people while maintaining safe distance is more valuable than actually understanding their lives and challenges. Victoria's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down with deliberate precision. Emma, dear, I think you may be misunderstanding Marcus's point. He's simply sharing his expertise in philanthropic strategy. And I'm sharing my expertise in actually working with the people he's theorizing about, I replied, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. But apparently that doesn't count as real knowledge in this family. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Robert cleared his throat, the sound carrying the weight of patriarchal authority being asserted. Perhaps we should remember that family dinners are meant to be pleasant occasions, he said in his measured corporate tone. Pleasant for whom? I asked, the question escaping before I could stop myself. For people who get to make assumptions about others without being challenged? For people who can dismiss entire communities as charity cases without ever examining their own prejudices? Catherine gasped audibly, as if I had committed an act of physical violence rather than verbal disagreement. Sophia's eyes went wide with the excitement of witnessing family drama unfold in real time. Margaret leaned back in her chair with an expression that might have been admiration if I hadn't been so focused on the hostile faces surrounding me. Victoria's mask of polite civility finally slipped completely. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the cold authority of someone who had spent decades enforcing social hierarchy through sheer force of will. I think, she said, each word carefully enunciated, that you have forgotten your place in this family, Emma. We have welcomed you with open arms, included you in our traditions, and treated you with nothing but kindness. If you cannot show appropriate gratitude and respect, perhaps you should reconsider whether you truly belong at this table. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Victoria had finally said what she had been thinking for 3 years. Finally dropped the pretense of acceptance and revealed the conditional nature of my inclusion in their family. I was welcome as long as I remained grateful, quiet, and appropriately humble about my inferior origins. Appropriate gratitude, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. For being tolerated. For being allowed to sit at your table and listen to your theories about people like me. People like you? Victoria's eyebrows rose in an expression of perfectly performed shock. What exactly do you mean by that? You know exactly what I mean, I said, standing up slowly. The motion felt both natural and surreal, as if I were watching myself from a distance. People who didn't inherit their worth. People who had to earn their place in the world. People whose value can't be measured by their trust fund balance or their family name. Robert's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Sit down, Emma. You're making a spectacle of yourself. No, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I'm finally telling the truth about what these dinners have always been. Performance exercises where I'm supposed to demonstrate gratitude for being included while you all reinforce why I don't really belong. David finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Please, let's not do this here. I turned to look at my husband, this man I had loved enough to marry despite the obvious challenges his family would present. His face was pale with embarrassment and fear, focused entirely on managing the social crisis rather than supporting his wife who was finally standing up for herself. "When would be a good time, David?" I asked. "When would it be convenient? For you to acknowledge that your family has spent 3 years making me feel worthless? When will you find the courage to defend the woman you supposedly love?" Victoria stood up as well, her composure restored to its usual state of controlled authority. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone delivering a final judgment. "You want to know the truth about worth, Emma?" she said, her eyes glittering with cold satisfaction. "Worth isn't something you earn through good intentions or hard work. Worth is something you inherit, something that comes from breeding and bloodlines and generations of achievement. You can put on our clothes and sit at our table and pretend to belong, but you will always be exactly what you were when David found you in that little restaurant in Chinatown. You will always be worthless." The word hit me like a physical blow, delivered with such precision and malice that it took my breath away. Victoria had finally revealed the truth that had always lurked beneath her polite facade. Not just that. I didn't belong, but that I was fundamentally without value, a worthless addition to their precious bloodline. The dining room fell into absolute silence. Even the household staff seemed to have frozen in place, sensing that something irreversible had just occurred. Victoria remained standing, her chin raised in defiant satisfaction at finally having spoken her truth. Robert looked like he was calculating the social damage of the scene that had just unfolded. The younger generation stared with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. David sat motionless, his face a mask of shock and horror. But his shock seemed focused on the scene itself, rather than the content of his mother's attack. He was embarrassed by the public nature of the confrontation, not outraged by the viciousness of her words. Margaret was the first person to move, rising slowly from her chair with an expression I couldn't quite read. She looked around the table, at her family members, her gaze lingering on Victoria with something that might have been discussed. "Well," she said quietly, "I think we've all learned something important about ourselves tonight." Before anyone could respond to Margaret's cryptic comment, the doorbell rang through the house. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence of the dining room, like an air raid siren announcing incoming disaster. Victoria frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption to her moment of triumph. "We're not expecting anyone," she said to no one in particular. "Staff has the evening off." The bell rang again, more insistently this time. Robert sighed and pushed back from the table. "I'll see who it is. Probably someone lost or looking for directions." He left the dining room while the rest of us remained frozen in our positions, the tension still crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. I could hear Robert's footsteps crossing the marble foyer, the sound of the heavy front door opening, and then muffled voices in conversation. After several minutes, Robert returned to the dining room accompanied by 3 people I didn't recognize. A woman in her 60s wearing a conservative business suit, and 2 men in expensive-looking coats, all carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of professional seriousness. "Family," Robert said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of confusion and concern. "These are representatives from the law firm of Hamilton, Sterling and Associates. They're here about grandmother Evelyn's estate." Victoria's face went pale. The estate was settled years ago. What could they possibly want now? The woman in the business suit stepped forward, her demeanor calm but authoritative. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Sandra Hamilton, senior partner at Hamilton Sterling. We apologize for the intrusion, but we have urgent legal matters that require the immediate attention of all family members present." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick legal document, her movements precise and professional. "We've been conducting a comprehensive review of Evelyn Blackwood's estate records at the request of the probate court. During this review, we discovered significant irregularities in the original will execution and documentation." Marcus leaned forward with the intense interest of someone who understood that family money was at stake. What kind of irregularities? Sandra Hamilton consulted her documents before continuing. We've discovered that Mrs. Evelyn Blackwood executed a final will and testament 3 days before her death, superseding all previous versions. This final will was properly witnessed and notarized, but was apparently misfiled in our archives, and only recently discovered during a comprehensive case review. The dining room had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Sandra Hamilton's voice and the rustle of legal documents. Even Victoria seemed to have forgotten her recent triumph over me. Her attention focused entirely on whatever bombshell was about to be dropped on the family's financial foundation. The newly discovered will, Sandra continued, contains provisions that significantly alter the distribution of Mrs. Blackwood's estate, including assets that were previously thought to have been distributed according to the earlier will. Robert found his voice first. What are you saying? That we received inheritance that wasn't legally ours? I'm saying, Sandra replied carefully, that the final will designates a primary beneficiary who was unknown to the family at the time of Mrs. Blackwood's death. Someone who was intentionally kept secret to protect them from exactly the kind of family dynamics we appear to have interrupted this evening. She turned to look directly at me, her expression softening slightly from professional neutrality to something approaching kindness. Emma Chen-Blackwood, she said formally. According to the final will and testament of Evelyn Margaret Blackwood, dated 3 days before her death, you are the primary beneficiary of her estate, valued at approximately $90 million. The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed, bouncing off the crystal chandelier and the oil paintings of stern ancestors who were suddenly revealed as irrelevant to the evening's proceedings. $90 million. Primary beneficiary. Emma Chen-Blackwood. I felt like I was experiencing the moment from outside my body, watching a woman who looked like me receive news that would change everything about her relationship to the people surrounding her. The family that had just finished explaining my worthlessness had suddenly discovered that I was worth more than all of them combined. Victoria's face had gone from pale to completely white, her carefully applied makeup standing out in stark contrast to her bloodless complexion. Robert sat down heavily in his chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances of pure shock, while Trevor and Sophia stared at me like I had just transformed into an entirely different species. David looked like he was having trouble processing the information, his mouth slightly open as he tried to reconcile the woman he had married with the primary beneficiary of his grandmother's fortune. Margaret, however, was smiling. Not with surprise, but with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting years for this moment to arrive. Grandmother Evelyn always was full of surprises, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. I wondered when this would finally come to light. Sandra Hamilton cleared her throat gently. There's more. The will includes specific instructions about the revelation of Mrs. Blackwood's reasoning for this decision. She left detailed letters explaining her choice, which she directed to be read aloud to the family when the inheritance was revealed. She withdrew another document from her briefcase, this one written in the shaky handwriting of an elderly woman. Would you like me to read Mrs. Blackwood's explanation now, or would you prefer to review the materials privately? I found my voice for the first time since the lawyers had arrived. Read it now, I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. I think everyone deserves to understand why. Sandra Hamilton adjusted her reading glasses and began to read in the same professional tone she had used to deliver the inheritance news. My dear family, if you are hearing this letter, it means that my final secret has finally been revealed. Emma, my darling girl, I hope you can forgive an old woman for keeping the truth hidden for so long. I also hope my family can forgive me for the shock this revelation will undoubtedly cause. Emma Chen is not just David's wife. She is my great-granddaughter, the child of my beloved daughter Margaret Chen, who I was forced to give up for adoption 65 years ago, when unmarried pregnancy would have destroyed my family's reputation and social standing. Margaret was raised by wonderful people who gave her opportunities I never could have provided as a single mother in 1960. She became Dr. Margaret Chen, a pioneering pediatric surgeon who dedicated her life to saving children. She married Dr. Henry Chen, and together they had 2 children, Emma's father David Chen and her Aunt Susan Chen Williams. I have watched Emma from a distance her entire life, through private investigators and carefully orchestrated encounters. I was there, hidden in the back, when she graduated valedictorian from high school. I attended her college graduation disguised as a university donor. I even ate at her parents' restaurant many times, always requesting tables where I could observe my great-granddaughter without being recognized. When David brought Emma to family dinner for the first time, I nearly revealed everything in that moment. The joy of finally meeting her properly, of seeing her intelligence and compassion firsthand, was almost overwhelming. But I also witnessed how Victoria and the others treated her, and I knew that revealing her true identity then would only create more complications for her happiness. I have spent 3 years watching my family's treatment of Emma with growing disgust and disappointment. You have revealed yourselves to be exactly the kind of people I raised you not to be: prejudiced, cruel, and obsessed with meaningless status. Distinctions. You have made my great-granddaughter feel unwelcome in her own family home. Emma, my darling, everything I own now belongs to you. The house, the investments, the business interests, the art collection, everything. You are the last true Blackwood, the only member of our family who embodies the values of kindness, integrity, and genuine worth that our name should represent. To the rest of my family, you have received generous gifts over the years that were intended to help you build meaningful lives. Emma's inheritance does not take anything away from you that you truly earned. It simply ensures that our family's legacy will continue through someone worthy of carrying it forward. Emma, use this gift wisely. Support the causes you care about. Help the young people you work with. Build something beautiful in the world. And remember that your worth was never determined by our family's acceptance. You have always been precious, valuable, and loved, even when you didn't know it. With all my love and deepest regrets for the deception, your great-grandmother, Evelyn Blackwood. The silence that followed the reading was so complete it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Sandra Hamilton folded the letter carefully and returned it to her briefcase, while her colleagues prepared additional documents that would formalize the inheritance transfer. I stared at the table, trying to process the cascade of revelations that had just upended everything I thought I knew about my life. Not only was I suddenly worth $90 million, but I was actually a blood relative of the family that had spent 3 years making me feel like an intruder. The irony was so profound it felt almost surreal. Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, like a fish gasping for air. The woman who had just called me worthless was now discovering that I was not only worth more than anyone else at the table, but that I was actually more of a Blackwood than she was. Her entire identity as the guardian of family bloodlines and breeding had just collapsed in the space of a single letter. Robert seemed to be doing rapid mental calculations, probably trying to figure out what this meant for the family business and their current lifestyle. His carefully constructed world of inherited privilege had just revealed itself to be built on a foundation he never understood. The grandson who had assumed his inheritance was secure was now face to face with the reality that the real Blackwood legacy belonged to someone else entirely. David looked completely shell-shocked, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been relief. His wife wasn't just some outsider he had inexplicably fallen in love with despite her inferior background. She was family in a way that made their marriage feel destined rather than rebellious. Marcus was staring at me with an expression of pure calculation, probably already trying to figure out how to position himself advantageously in this new family hierarchy. His entire identity as a philanthropic heir had just been revealed as fundamentally fraudulent, while the woman he had been lecturing about charitable work was now in a position to fund more social programs than his foundation could ever hope to support. Catherine appeared to be experiencing some kind of emotional breakdown, her perfectly composed museum curator facade cracking to reveal the panic underneath. Her position as the family's cultural authority had just been handed to someone she had spent years dismissing as culturally inferior. The art collection she had assumed would eventually be hers now belonged to the woman she had patronized about ethnic cuisine. Trevor and Sophia looked like they were watching a movie, their young faces reflecting the excitement of witnessing family drama that would reshape their entire futures. The trust fund babies who had never questioned their inherited wealth were now discovering that their inheritance had always belonged to someone else. Margaret, however, was beaming with genuine joy and satisfaction. Her reaction suggested that she had known more about this situation than she had ever let on, that she had been waiting for years for this moment to arrive. Sandra Hamilton cleared her throat gently, drawing everyone's attention back to the legal proceedings at hand. There are additional documents that need to be reviewed, including detailed financial statements and property transfer papers. Mrs. Chen-Blackwood will need to schedule meetings to discuss the full scope of your inheritance and the various options for managing such a substantial estate. Mrs. Chen-Blackwood. Even hearing the name spoken aloud felt strange, like putting on clothes that belonged to someone else. I had been Emma Chen-Blackwood for 3 years, but now the name carried weight and meaning I had never imagined. I wasn't just married to a Blackwood. I was the Blackwood who mattered most. "I need some air," I said quietly, standing up from the table. The dining room suddenly felt suffocating, filled with the weight of decades of deception and the shock of revelations that were still settling into my consciousness. "I need to think about all of this." Sandra Hamilton nodded understandingly. "Of course, this is overwhelming news under any circumstances, and receiving it in this setting makes it even more challenging to process. Here's my card. Please call my office tomorrow morning and we'll arrange a private meeting to discuss everything in detail." I took the card with trembling fingers, the expensive paper feeling substantial and real in a way that made the inheritance seem more concrete. Tomorrow I would wake up as one of the wealthiest women in the state, but tonight I was still trying to understand what that meant for the woman I had always believed myself to be. David stood up as well, reaching for my hand. Let me drive. You home. We need to talk about this." I looked at my husband, this man who had sat silent while his mother called me worthless, who had prioritized social harmony over defending his wife. The inheritance changed the external circumstances of our relationship, but it didn't address the fundamental issues that had been eroding our marriage for months. "I think I need some time alone tonight," I said gently. "This is too much to process with an audience." Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Emma, we need to discuss this as a family. There are legal implications, business considerations, practical matters that require immediate attention." The assumption that I would automatically include them in decisions about my inheritance was breathtaking in its audacity. The woman who had just finished explaining my worthlessness was now demanding inclusion in planning how to manage my newly revealed wealth. The entitlement was so complete, it almost seemed unconscious. "Actually," I said, looking directly at Victoria, "I think I've had enough family discussion for one evening. I'll make my own decisions about how to handle my great-grandmother's legacy." Margaret stepped forward with a warm smile. "Emma, dear, would you like me to drive you home? I think a quiet conversation might help you process all of this." The offer surprised me, coming from the family member I barely knew. But Margaret's genuine warmth stood in stark contrast to the calculating expressions surrounding us, and the idea of talking to someone who wasn't immediately affected by the inheritance felt appealing. "That would be nice," I said. "Thank you." As Margaret and I prepared to leave, Victoria made one last attempt to assert control over the situation. Emma, I hope you understand that family loyalty works both ways. We've supported you throughout your marriage to David, and now that your circumstances have changed, we expect that support to be reciprocated. The statement was so divorced from reality that I actually laughed out loud. The idea that the Blackwood family had supported me rather than barely tolerated my presence was such a complete reversal of the truth that it revealed how thoroughly Victoria had convinced herself of her own narrative. Supported me? I repeated, looking around the table at faces that had shown me nothing but condescension and barely concealed hostility for 3 years. Is that what you call making me feel unwelcome at every gathering? Is that what you call questioning my worth and dismissing my career? Is that what you call refusing to acknowledge my maiden name on invitations? Robert attempted to smooth things over with his practiced corporate diplomacy. Emma, I think emotions are running high tonight. Perhaps we should all take some time to adjust to this new information before making any hasty decisions. The only hasty decision I made, I replied, was believing that I needed your acceptance to have value. Turns out I was worth $90 million all along, regardless of what any of you thought about my background or my marriage to David. The number hung in the air like a challenge, a reminder that the power dynamics in the room had shifted so completely that previous hierarchies no longer applied. I wasn't the outsider seeking acceptance anymore. I was the primary stakeholder in their family legacy, and they were the ones who needed to justify their place in my world. Margaret touched my arm gently. Shall we go? I think some fresh air would do you good. As we walked toward the foyer, I could hear urgent whispered conversations breaking out behind us. The Blackwood family was about to have the most important discussion of their lives, and for the first time in 3 years, I wouldn't be there to witness their deliberations about my place in their world. Margaret's car was a practical sedan. That looked modest compared to the luxury vehicles filling the driveway. As we settled into the comfortable seats and she started the engine, I felt some of the tension in my shoulders begin to ease for the first time all evening. How long have you known? I asked as we pulled out of the estate's gates. Margaret smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been keeping a delicious secret. About you being Evelyn's great-granddaughter? I've known since the day David first brought you to dinner. You look exactly like your great-aunt Margaret at that age. Evelyn showed me pictures over the years. She showed you pictures? The idea that my great-grandmother had been watching my life from a distance felt both comforting and strange. She was so proud of you, Margaret continued, her voice warm with genuine affection. She kept detailed scrapbooks about your academic achievements, your social work, even newspaper clippings when your high school debate team won the state championship. She knew more about your life than most grandmothers know about their grandchildren. The image of Evelyn Blackwood, the formidable family matriarch I had barely known, quietly collecting evidence of my accomplishments felt almost too poignant to process. While I had been struggling to earn acceptance from her family, she had been celebrating my successes in secret. Why didn't she tell me? I asked. Why keep it secret for so long? Margaret was quiet for several moments, choosing her words carefully. Evelyn was a woman of her generation, shaped by different rules about family scandal and social propriety. Giving up a child for adoption in 1960 wasn't something wealthy families discussed openly. She spent decades protecting that secret, and by the time social attitudes changed enough to make revelation possible, the deception had taken on a life of its own. She paused at a red light and turned to look at me directly. But I also think she wanted to see what kind of people her family really were. Your presence gave her a chance to observe their true character, without the filters of obligation and inheritance expectations. What she saw disappointed her deeply. The traffic light changed, and we continued through the quiet suburban streets, past houses that glowed with warm light from behind expensive window treatments. Everything about this neighborhood spoke of old money and established families, the kind of generational wealth that created its own insular world. The way they treated you tonight was inexcusable, Margaret said quietly. But it wasn't surprising. Victoria has spent so many years trying to prove she belongs in high society that she's become ruthless about excluding anyone she sees as beneath her station. The irony is that her own background isn't much different from yours. This was news. To me. What do you mean? Victoria Palmer was a secretary at Robert's law firm when they met. Her father sold insurance and her mother worked part-time at a department store. She transformed herself completely to fit into the Blackwood world. And she's never forgiven anyone who reminds her of where she came from. The revelation added another layer to the evening's dramatic reversals. The woman who had spent 3 years making me feel inferior about my working-class background had come from virtually identical circumstances. Her hostility toward me suddenly made more sense, though it didn't make it any less cruel. She sees you as a threat, Margaret continued, because you represent everything she's tried to distance herself from. Your comfort with your own background, your pride in your parents' achievements, your refusal to be ashamed of your origins. It challenges the entire foundation of her reconstructed identity. We pulled into the parking area outside my apartment building, the modest complex looking particularly humble after an evening at Willowbrook Estate. But for the first time in months, the sight of our small home felt welcoming rather than embarrassing. It was a place where I could be myself without performance or pretense. Margaret turned off the engine but made no move to leave. Can I offer you some advice about what comes next? I nodded, grateful for guidance from someone who seemed to understand the complexities of the situation. Don't make any major decisions for at least a week, she said. This kind of sudden wealth can be overwhelming, and there will be enormous pressure from various family members to involve them in your planning. Take time to understand your options before committing to anything. What about David? I asked. How do I handle this with my marriage? Margaret's expression grew more serious. That's the most complicated question of all. David loves you, but he's also been shaped by his family's values in ways he may not even recognize. Tonight will force him to choose between his loyalty to their world and his commitment to you. That choice will reveal things about his character that neither of you may have fully understood before. Her insight felt both helpful and ominous. My marriage had already been strained by the constant pressure of family dynamics. Adding sudden wealth and revealed bloodlines would create new challenges that we might not be equipped to handle. The money changes everything and nothing, Margaret observed. It gives you freedom from their approval, but it doesn't automatically fix the relationships that have been damaged. Some things can be repaired with time and effort. Others may be beyond healing. As I prepared to get out of the car, Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. Evelyn asked me to give this to you when the inheritance was revealed. She said you would understand its significance. I accepted the package with curiosity, feeling something small and substantial wrapped in soft cloth. Thank you for everything tonight. For the ride, for the honesty, for being kind when everyone else was calculating. Margaret smiled warmly. Emma, dear, you're about to discover that wealth brings its own set of challenges. But you have something that money can't buy. Genuine character and strong values. Trust those instincts over the advice of people who are motivated by what they can gain from your new circumstances. I watched her drive away before walking up to our apartment, the package clutched in my hand like a talisman. The familiar hallway felt different somehow, as if seeing it through the lens of sudden wealth had changed its fundamental nature. These modest surroundings that had felt restrictive just hours ago now seemed like a sanctuary where I could process the evening's revelations without external pressure. David's key turned in the lock just as I was settling onto our couch with a cup of tea. He entered quietly, his face reflecting the emotional exhaustion of the most dramatic evening in our family's history. We looked at each other across the small living room, both of us struggling to find words for a situation that had no precedent in our relationship. How are you feeling? He asked finally, settling into the chair across from me. Overwhelmed, I admitted. Confused, angry, vindicated. It's like experiencing every emotion at once. David nodded, running his hands through his hair in the gesture that always indicated stress. I keep trying to process what this means for us, for our marriage, for my relationship with my family. What did they say after I left? I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know the answer. There was a lot of shock, some panic about what this means for their financial security. Mother was hysterical about the social implications. Father was already talking about legal challenges, though the lawyers made it clear that grandmother's will is ironclad. David paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. Marcus suggested that you might be willing to share the inheritance with the family, since we're all blood relatives. Catherine thought you might want to establish a foundation that would employ family members in management roles. The speed with which his relatives had moved from calling me worthless to planning how to benefit from my inheritance was breathtaking. Within hours of learning about my wealth, they were already strategizing ways to access it while maintaining their sense of superiority. "And what did you say?" I asked. David's silence stretched long enough to answer my question before he spoke. I said that any decisions about the inheritance were yours to make. But Emma, I also have to be honest about what this means for our future together. The careful tone in his voice made my stomach clench with anticipation. I had been expecting this conversation, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. "I love you," he continued, "but I also have to acknowledge that tonight changed fundamental things about our relationship. You're not just my wife anymore. You're one of the wealthiest women in the state, with social and financial responsibilities I never imagined you would have." "Does that change how you feel about me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands while he chose his words. "It changes how I feel about myself. For 3 years, I've been the Blackwood in our relationship, the one with the family connections and social advantages. I've felt protective of you, responsible for helping you navigate my family's world. Now I'm the one who doesn't understand the implications of your situation." His honesty was both painful and clarifying. David had always seen himself as my guide to the upper-class world, the bridge between my humble background and his family's elevated status. The revelation that I actually had more claim to that world than he did had fundamentally altered his sense of identity within our marriage. "I need to ask you something," I said, setting down my teacup and looking at him directly. "Tonight, when your mother called me worthless, you said nothing. When Marcus dismissed my professional experience, you told me to change the subject. When your family spent the evening making it clear that I didn't belong, you prioritized keeping peace over defending your wife. Would you handle those situations differently now that you know about the inheritance?" David's face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. "That's not fair, Emma. Tonight was unprecedented. Nobody knew how to handle what was happening." "Tonight was just more extreme than usual," I corrected. "But the pattern has been consistent for 3 years. You've watched your family diminish me, dismiss my background, and make me feel unwelcome, and you've chosen their comfort over my dignity every single time. The accusation hung between us like a bridge that could either connect us or collapse entirely." David's response would determine whether our marriage could survive not just the sudden wealth, but the underlying issues that had been eroding our relationship long before the inheritance was revealed. "You're right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been a coward about confronting my family. I've let them treat you badly because it was easier than dealing with their disapproval. I kept telling myself that their acceptance would come with time, that it wasn't worth creating permanent family rifts over temporary social awkwardness." His admission was more honest than I had expected, but it also confirmed what I had suspected about his priorities. David loved me, but he loved his family's approval more. He wanted harmony with both. but when forced to choose, he consistently chose them over me. The inheritance doesn't change that pattern, I pointed out. If anything, it makes it more complicated. Now you have to choose between your loyalty to them and your marriage to someone who has the power to cut them off financially. David winced at the blunt assessment. Are you saying you want to punish them? Use the money to get revenge for how they treated you? I'm saying that your family's treatment of me revealed their true character, and money doesn't change character. Victoria didn't call me worthless because she was protecting limited resources. She called me worthless because she genuinely believes some people are inherently more valuable than others based on their background and bloodlines. I picked up Margaret's wrapped package and began carefully removing the soft cloth covering. Inside was a delicate gold locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful in its simple elegance. When I opened it, I found two small photographs: a young woman who looked remarkably like me, and a baby who could have been my own childhood picture. This must be your great-aunt Margaret and her daughter, David said, looking over my shoulder at the photographs. The daughter who was given up for adoption. My grandmother, I said softly, tracing the outline of the baby's face with my finger. This is probably the only picture Evelyn had of her daughter for 65 years. The weight of my great-grandmother's sacrifice suddenly became more real. She had given up not just a child, but decades of relationship, memories, and connection to protect her family's reputation. The locket represented all the love and loss that secret had cost her. She must have been incredibly lonely, I whispered, keeping this secret for so many years, watching her family from a distance, never being able to acknowledge the most important relationship in her life. David reached for my hand, his touch, gentle and familiar despite the evening's revelations. She protected you by keeping the secret. If the family had known about your connection, they might have treated you differently but not necessarily better. They might have seen you as a threat to their inheritance rather than an addition to their family. His insight was probably accurate. The Blackwood family's reaction to learning about my inheritance had revealed their priorities clearly enough. They were more concerned about their financial security than excited about discovering a new family member. My value to them would always be measured in dollars rather than relationship. What happens now? David asked, the question encompassing our marriage, my inheritance, and the complex family dynamics that would have to be navigated going forward. I don't know, I admitted. Everything feels different now, but I'm not sure what that means. For practical decisions, I need time to understand what Evelyn intended, what responsibilities come with this inheritance, what kind of life I want to build with this opportunity. David nodded, though I could see the anxiety in his expression. His entire world had been upended in the course of a single evening, and unlike me, he didn't have the vindication of finally being recognized as valuable. He was dealing with the loss of his assumed identity as the privileged partner in our relationship. "Can I ask for one thing?" he said. "Can we make decisions about our marriage separately from decisions about the inheritance? I know the two are connected, but I don't want our relationship to become another transaction in this family's financial calculations." The request was reasonable, though I wasn't sure it was possible to completely separate our personal relationship from the broader family dynamics that had shaped it. The inheritance didn't create our marital problems, but it certainly illuminated them in ways that couldn't be ignored. "I can try," I said. "But David, you need to understand that the woman who walked out of your family's dinner tonight isn't the same person who walked in. Not because of the money, but because I finally stopped trying to earn acceptance from people who will never see me as truly worthy. That changes things between us whether we acknowledge it or not." We talked until nearly midnight, circling around the fundamental questions without reaching any definitive conclusions. By the time we went to bed, we had agreed to take things slowly to avoid making major decisions while emotions were still raw, and to find some form of marriage counseling to help us navigate the new dynamics that had emerged. But as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had revealed truths about our relationship that no amount of counseling could completely address. David's pattern of choosing family harmony over supporting me wasn't likely to change just because my bank account had. If anything, the inheritance would create new pressures that would test his loyalties in ways we hadn't yet imagined. The next morning brought a steady stream of phone calls and messages that made it clear the news of my inheritance had spread quickly through the Blackwood family's social network. Victoria called 3 times before noon, each message becoming more urgent in its requests for a family meeting to discuss the situation. Marcus left a voicemail explaining his ideas for charitable foundations that could benefit from my good fortune. Catherine sent a lengthy email about the importance of maintaining the family's cultural legacy through continued support of the arts. Only Margaret called without an agenda, simply checking to see how I was processing everything and offering to accompany me to my meeting with the lawyers if I wanted moral support. Her genuine concern stood in stark contrast to the calculating messages from everyone else, reinforcing my sense that she was the only family member whose motives I could trust. Sandra Hamilton's office occupied an entire floor of the city's most prestigious law firm, with windows offering panoramic views of the harbor and conference rooms designed to impress the wealthiest clients. When I arrived for our meeting, I was escorted into a private office that spoke of discretion and decades of experience managing substantial estates. "Mrs. Chen-Blackwood," Sandra said, rising to greet me with professional warmth. "I hope you've had time to process some of yesterday evening's revelations. I know the circumstances of the disclosure were quite dramatic." "It's been overwhelming," I admitted, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "I'm still trying to understand what this inheritance actually means in practical terms." Sandra opened a thick file folder and began spreading documents across her desk. "Let me walk you through the specifics. Your great-grandmother's estate includes the Willowbrook property and its contents, valued at approximately $12 million. There are also investment portfolios worth $68 million, a collection of rare art and antiques worth $8 million, and various business interests that generate substantial annual income." The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like discussing the distance between planets rather than actual money that now belonged to me. "What kind of business interests?" "Real estate holdings primarily, though there are also investments in technology companies and renewable energy projects." Mrs. Blackwood was quite forward-thinking in her investment strategies. "The portfolio generates approximately $4 million in annual income after taxes and management fees. $4 million per year. More money than most families would see in a lifetime, arriving automatically without any effort on my part." The magnitude of the inheritance was beginning to feel real, in a way that made my modest apartment and careful budgeting seem like artifacts from a previous life. "There are also specific instructions about certain family members," Sandra continued, consulting another document. "Mrs. Blackwood established trust funds for David, Marcus, Catherine, and the younger generation, but these are significantly smaller than what they had previously expected to inherit. She also made provisions for household staff and long-time employees." "What did the family think they were going to inherit?" I asked, curious about how dramatically their expectations had been altered. Based on previous versions of the will, they expected the estate to be divided among all family members, with Robert and Victoria receiving the largest shares as the senior generation. The total inheritance for the entire family would have been substantial, but nowhere near what you're receiving as the sole primary beneficiary. This explained the panic and calculation I had witnessed in their reactions. They hadn't just learned that I was wealthy. They had discovered that their own financial security was much more modest than they had assumed. The inheritance they had been counting on to maintain their lifestyle had been redirected to the woman they had spent 3 years treating as an outsider. Mrs. Blackwood also left specific instructions about how she wanted the inheritance to be used, Sandra said, withdrawing. Another letter from the file. Would you like me to read her guidance, or would you prefer to review it privately? Please read it, I said, remembering how powerful it had been to hear Evelyn's words spoken aloud at the family dinner. Sandra adjusted her glasses and began, reading in the same clear voice she had used the previous evening. My dear Emma, if you are reading this, it means that you have finally learned the truth about your place in our family. I hope this knowledge brings you joy rather than burden, though I suspect the circumstances of its revelation may have been challenging. I am leaving you this inheritance not just because you are my blood, but because you are the person I most trust to use it wisely. I have watched you dedicate your career to helping others, prioritize kindness over status, and maintain your integrity despite significant pressure to conform to expectations that would diminish your authentic self. I have specific hopes for how you might use this gift. Continue your work with young people who need advocates and support. Create opportunities for others who face the same kinds of barriers you have overcome. Use the house and its resources to bring people together in ways that celebrate authenticity rather than performance. Most importantly, do not let this inheritance change who you are at your core. The money is a tool, not an identity. Your worth has never been determined by your bank account, and it should not be now, even though the numbers have changed dramatically. As for my family, I leave that relationship in your capable hands. Some of them may prove worthy of your forgiveness and continued connection. Others may reveal themselves to be too committed to their prejudices and entitlement to deserve your time and energy. Trust your instincts about who deserves second chances and who should be left to face the consequences of their choices. Build something beautiful with this gift, my darling girl. Make choices that honor both your heritage and your values. And remember that the greatest inheritance I can give you is not the money itself, but the freedom it provides to live according to your deepest principles without compromise. With endless love and complete confidence in your judgment, your great-grandmother, Evelyn. The letter left me emotionally drained and simultaneously energized. Evelyn's faith in my character felt like both a blessing and a tremendous responsibility. She wasn't just leaving me money, she was entrusting me with the power to reshape our family's legacy according to my own values and vision. There are practical matters we need to discuss, Sandra said gently, allowing me time to absorb the letter's contents. Tax implications, investment management, estate planning for your own future. But these decisions don't need to be made immediately. We can work through them systematically over the coming weeks. I nodded, grateful for the structured approach to what felt like an overwhelming array of choices. What about the house? What's involved in actually living there? Willowbrook comes with a full household staff who have been employed there for many years. Mrs. Blackwood provided for their continued employment and generous severance packages if you choose to make changes. The property is maintained by a groundskeeping service and managed by a property management company. You could move in immediately if you choose, or maintain it as it is while you decide how you want to use the space. The idea of living in the mansion where I had felt so unwelcome just days ago seemed almost surreal. The dining room where Victoria had called me worthless would now be mine to use as I saw fit. The formal living room where family members had dismissed my professional work would become my space to entertain guests who actually valued my presence. I'd like to see the house again, I said, but privately, without the family there. I want to understand what Evelyn envisioned for how I might use the space. Sandra made notes about arranging a private tour with the property manager. There are also personal items that Mrs. Blackwood specifically wanted you to have. Family photographs, jewelry, documents about your grandmother's life before the adoption. She gathered everything she could find about the daughter she gave up, hoping that someday she might be able to share that history with you. The thought of finally learning about my grandmother's life, of understanding the family history that had been kept secret for so many decades, felt both exciting and emotionally overwhelming. I would finally have answers to questions I hadn't even known to ask about my heritage and identity. As our meeting concluded, Sandra handed me a business card and a key ring. This gives you access to the house and the safe deposit boxes where Mrs. Blackwood stored important documents and jewelry. Take your time exploring everything. This inheritance represents not just wealth, but family history that belongs to you now. Walking out of the law office with the keys to a $12 million mansion in my purse felt like stepping into someone else's life. The city streets looked the same, but my relationship to everything around me had fundamentally changed. I was no longer someone struggling to afford rent and groceries. I was someone who could buy buildings if I chose to. The weight of such sudden wealth felt both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in my adult life, I had complete freedom to make choices based on my values rather than my financial limitations. I could quit my job tomorrow and dedicate myself entirely to advocacy work. I could fund programs for at-risk youth that government budgets couldn't support. I could create opportunities for other young women from immigrant families who faced the same kinds of barriers I had encountered. But the inheritance also came with the burden of managing complex family relationships that had been damaged by years of prejudice and misunderstanding. Victoria's hostility wouldn't disappear just because I now had more money than she did. If anything, my new status might make her even more resentful, especially if she perceived it as validation of everything she had tried to keep out of her reconstructed upper-class identity. David's reaction would be equally complex to navigate. He loved me, but he also struggled with his own sense of identity within his family's hierarchy. My sudden elevation to primary inheritor would force him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own relationships and loyalties. Our marriage would have to be rebuilt on a foundation that acknowledged these new realities rather than pretending they didn't exist. As I drove home to our modest apartment, I found myself thinking about Evelyn's guidance to trust my instincts about who deserved second chances and who should be left to face the consequences of their choices. The inheritance gave me the power to reward or withhold financial support, but more importantly, it gave me the freedom to choose my relationships based on how people treated me, rather than how much I needed their acceptance. For 3 years, I had been trying to earn my place at the Blackwood family table. Now I owned the table, and everyone else would have to earn their place with me. The following week passed in a blur of legal meetings, financial consultations, and increasingly desperate calls from various Blackwood family members. Each conversation revealed more about their true priorities and character than 3 years of formal dinners ever had. Victoria's calls evolved from demanding immediate family meetings to suggesting that surely I understood the importance of maintaining family unity during such a challenging transition. Marcus pitched elaborate foundation structures that would employ him as director while allowing me to claim credit for charitable giving. Catherine sent detailed proposals for art acquisitions that would enhance the family collection while supporting her career as a curator. Only David seemed genuinely conflicted about how to approach the situation. He had moved back to his childhood bedroom at Willowbrook temporarily, claiming he needed space to think about our future. The irony of my husband seeking refuge in the house that now belonged to me wasn't lost on either of us, but we both needed time to process what this inheritance meant for our relationship. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my apartment. I opened the door to find a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, carrying a bouquet of flowers from what appeared to be a professional florist. "Emma, dear," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Helen Morrison, Evelyn's oldest friend. I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced, but I felt I needed to meet you properly now that the truth has finally come out." I invited her in, curious about this connection to my great-grandmother that I hadn't known existed. Helen settled onto my couch with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to making herself welcome wherever she went. "Evelyn talked about you constantly," Helen said without preamble. "She was so proud of your accomplishments, so worried about how the family was treating you, so torn about whether to reveal the truth. She spent hours agonizing over when and how to tell you about your heritage. She never gave any indication that she knew who I was," I said. remembering the few interactions I had had with my great-grandmother during family gatherings. She was always polite, but distant. Helen laughed softly. Evelyn was terrified that if she showed you any special attention, someone in the family would start asking questions. She practiced being appropriately formal with you, rehearsing conversations in front of her mirror to make sure she didn't reveal too much affection. The image of my elderly great-grandmother practicing indifference toward me was both heartbreaking and somehow comforting. She hadn't been cold. She had been protecting both of us from premature discovery of our connection. "She left something else for you," Helen continued, withdrawing an envelope from her purse. "She gave this to me years ago with instructions to deliver it personally after the inheritance was revealed. She didn't trust it to the lawyers, wanted to make sure it came from someone who loved her." I opened the envelope carefully, finding several pages of handwritten letter and a small antique key. Evelyn's writing was more labored than in her previous letters, suggesting this had been written during her final illness. "My dearest Emma," the letter began, "if Helen is reading this to you, it means that my final plan has succeeded and you now understand your true place in our family. I have spent my last months planning not just your inheritance, but also your freedom from the obligations that money sometimes creates. The key Helen has given you opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box number 847. Inside, you will find documents, photographs, and jewelry that belong to your grandmother Margaret. But more importantly, you will find letters she wrote to me over the years, letters I was never able to answer because of the secrecy surrounding her adoption. Margaret knew about me, Emma. When she turned 18, she hired a private investigator to find her birth mother. We exchanged letters for nearly 30 years, though we never met in person. She told me about her medical career, her marriage to Henry, her children, and eventually about you. She was as proud of you as any grandmother could be, and she understood why I couldn't acknowledge our relationship publicly. Margaret died, knowing that someday I would find a way to connect with you. She made me promise to ensure that you would have choices in life that she never had, opportunities that money could provide without the burden of family obligation that had shaped my own limited options. The inheritance comes with no strings attached, my darling. Use it as you see fit. Love whom you choose. Build the life that reflects your values. And remember that your worth has never been determined by the Blackwood name or fortune. You were precious before you knew about the money, and you remain precious regardless of how you choose to use it. The letter continued with specific details about family history, medical information, and practical advice about managing wealth. But I found myself focused on the revelation that my grandmother had known about Evelyn all along. The adoption that had seemed like a complete severing of family ties had actually created a secret connection that lasted decades. Helen watched me read with patient understanding. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," she said when I finished. "She saved lives as a surgeon while raising her own family and maintaining a correspondence with the mother she had never been allowed to know. Evelyn treasured every letter, every photograph Margaret sent over the years." "Did my father know?" I asked, wondering how many family secrets had been kept from various generations. "Margaret told your father about Evelyn when he was in college," Helen replied. "She wanted him to understand his heritage, even though they agreed that revealing the connection publicly would be too complicated while Evelyn was still alive. Your father chose not to tell you, thinking it would be too painful to know about a great-grandmother you could never acknowledge." The revelation that my father had known about our Blackwood connection all along added another layer to the evening's emotional complexity. I thought about all the times he had listened to me complain about David's family without ever mentioning that I was actually related to them. His restraint must have required enormous self-control. Helen stayed for nearly 2 hours, sharing stories about Evelyn and Margaret that filled in decades of family history I had never known existed. When she finally left, I sat surrounded by photographs and documents that told the story of a family, connection that had survived adoption, secrecy, and social pressure. That afternoon, I drove to the bank to open the safe deposit box Evelyn had left for me. The contents were carefully organized in manila folders labeled with dates and subjects. Photographs of my grandmother at various ages, from childhood through her medical career. Letters written in her precise handwriting, describing her life and asking questions about Evelyn's world that could never be answered directly. Medical school graduation announcements, wedding invitations, birth certificates for her children, and eventually, newspaper clippings about my own achievements that she had sent to Evelyn over the years. Reading my grandmother's letters to Evelyn felt like discovering a secret conversation that had been happening parallel to my entire life. Margaret had written about her hopes for her granddaughter, her pride in my academic success, her concerns about the challenges I might face as a first-generation college student. She had died when I was 15, too early to see me graduate from college or begin my social work career, but her letters revealed that she had believed in my potential long before I understood it myself. One letter, written shortly before Margaret's death, contained specific advice about navigating upper-class social situations, should I ever encounter them. She had somehow anticipated that my path might eventually lead to encounters with people like the Blackwoods, and she had offered guidance about maintaining authentic identity while adapting to different social expectations. Her wisdom felt remarkably relevant to the challenges I had faced during 3 years of family dinners. The jewelry in the safe deposit box included Margaret's medical school pin, her wedding ring, and a simple gold bracelet engraved with the names of her children and grandchildren. Wearing her wedding ring felt like claiming connection to family history that had always belonged to me, but had been kept secret for practical reasons. By Friday evening, I felt ready to make some decisions about how to move forward with my inheritance and my relationships. I called Sandra Hamilton to schedule a meeting about establishing a foundation focused on supporting first-generation college students and at-risk youth. I also called the property management company to arrange a private tour of Willowbrook Estate, wanting to see my inheritance through the lens of possibility rather than past humiliation. Most importantly, I called David and asked him to meet me at our apartment Saturday morning for a conversation about our future. His voice carried nervous hope when he agreed, suggesting that he had been waiting for this discussion as anxiously as I had been preparing for it. Saturday morning arrived with unusual clarity and purpose. I had spent Friday evening organizing my thoughts about what I wanted from our marriage going forward and what I was willing to compromise to achieve it. David arrived precisely on time, carrying coffee and pastries from the bakery where we had shared our first official date 4 years ago. "I've done a lot of thinking this week," he said, settling into the chair across from me in our small living room. "About us, about my family, about what kind of husband I've been and what kind I want to become." "I've been thinking too," I replied, "about what I need from our relationship and whether those needs can be met given everything that's happened." David took a deep breath before continuing. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened at Sunday dinner. I've spent 3 years choosing the path of least resistance instead of defending you, prioritizing my family's comfort over your dignity. That was cowardice disguised as diplomacy, and I'm ashamed of how long it took me to recognize the damage it was doing." His honesty was more direct than I had expected, suggesting that the week apart had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own behavior. "What changed your mind?" I asked. "Living back at Willowbrook this week showed me how toxic the environment really is," he admitted. "Without you there to absorb their criticism and judgment, it all turned toward me." Suddenly, I was the son who had failed to manage his wife properly, who had allowed an outsider to gain access to family resources. "I got a taste of what you've been experiencing for years, and it was unbearable." David's recognition of the family dynamics was encouraging, but I needed to understand whether his newfound awareness would translate into different behavior going forward. What does that mean for how you want to handle family relationships in the future? It means I'm done trying to maintain peace with people who have revealed themselves to be fundamentally cruel and prejudiced, he said firmly. My mother's behavior last Sunday was inexcusable, and my father's calculations about how to maintain access to your inheritance are equally disgusting. I can't pretend those attitudes are acceptable just because they come from family members. The strength in his voice surprised me. David had never spoken about his family with such clear moral judgment before. The inheritance crisis seemed to have finally forced him to choose sides in a conflict he had been trying to avoid for years. What about your career? I asked, knowing that his law firm connections were largely based on Blackwood family relationships. What about the social and professional consequences of cutting ties with your family? David smiled with something that looked like relief. I've actually been offered a position with the district attorney's office, prosecuting white-collar crime. The pay is lower than private practice, but the work is more meaningful. I've been afraid to take it because it would disappoint my father and reduce our household income. Those constraints don't apply anymore. The idea of David finally pursuing the public service career he had always wanted felt like a positive step toward building an authentic life together. You want to prosecute wealthy criminals instead of defending them. I want to hold people accountable for using their privilege to harm others, he said, including potentially some of my family's business associates if they've been cutting ethical corners. The inheritance gives us the freedom for me to follow my conscience without worrying about maintaining the lifestyle my family expects. His willingness to potentially investigate his own family's business practices suggested a level of moral commitment I hadn't been sure he possessed. The inheritance was giving him permission to be the person he had always wanted to be professionally. What about us personally? I asked. What does this mean for our marriage going forward? David reached for my hands, his touch warm and familiar despite the week of separation. It means I want to rebuild our relationship based on who we actually are, rather than who we thought we were supposed to be. You're not the grateful outsider anymore, and I'm not the privileged insider. We're both just people trying to figure out how to use unexpected opportunities to build something meaningful. His perspective felt both realistic and hopeful. The inheritance had stripped away pretenses that had been shaping our relationship since the beginning, revealing both strengths and weaknesses that had been hidden beneath layers of assumed social roles. I need you to understand something, I said carefully. The woman who walked out of your family's dinner last Sunday isn't going back to being the person who tried so hard to earn their approval. That version of myself is gone permanently. I'm going to use this inheritance to support causes I care about, help people your family would consider beneath their notice, and build relationships with people who value authenticity over performance. David nodded seriously. I want to be part of that. I want to support the work you're passionate about instead of making excuses for why you should adjust to other people's expectations. This inheritance doesn't just give you freedom, it gives both of us the chance to live according to our actual values. Our conversation continued for several hours, covering practical details about how we would handle family relationships, career transitions, and the logistics of managing substantial wealth while maintaining our core identities. By the end of the morning, we had reached a tentative agreement to rebuild our marriage on this new foundation, with clear boundaries about family involvement and shared commitment to using our resources for social good. That afternoon, we drove together to Willowbrook Estate for my private tour of the property. The house felt completely different without the oppressive presence of family members who had made me feel unwelcome there for so many years. Empty of their judgment and calculation, it revealed itself as a beautiful space with enormous potential for creating the kind of inclusive, authentic gatherings Evelyn had envisioned. The staff who greeted us were warm and professional, clearly relieved to have clarity about their employment future. Mrs. Patterson, the longtime housekeeper, gave us a comprehensive tour that included rooms I had never seen during family gatherings, including Evelyn's private study where she had planned my inheritance and written the letters that had changed everything. The study contained dozens of photo albums documenting my life from a distance, newspaper clippings about my achievements, and carefully preserved copies of every letter Margaret had sent over the years. Evelyn had created a shrine to the family, relationship she could never acknowledge publicly, maintaining connection across decades of enforced separation. Mrs. Blackwood spent hours in this room during her final months, Mrs. Patterson explained. She was always organizing papers and writing letters, preparing for something she said would happen after she was gone. She was so excited about it, like she was planning the best surprise party in the world. The image of my elderly great-grandmother plotting my inheritance like a delightful conspiracy made me smile despite the emotional weight of the moment. She had found a way to transform her final act into a gift that would reshape our entire family's future according to her values rather than their prejudices. David and I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the grounds and discussing how the property might be used for the foundation I was planning to establish. The estate had enough space for offices, meeting rooms, and residential programs for young people who needed temporary housing while pursuing education or job training. Evelyn's legacy could become a practical resource for addressing exactly the kinds of social problems I had been working on throughout my career. Sunday morning brought the inevitable confrontation I had been expecting all week. Victoria called demanding an immediate family meeting to discuss what she termed the irregularities in Mother Blackwood's estate planning. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades getting her way through sheer force of will, apparently believing that demanding enough would eventually produce the results she wanted. "I think it's time," I told David after ending the call. "Time to have the conversation with your family about how relationships are going to work going forward." We arranged to meet at Willowbrook that afternoon, with Sandra Hamilton present, to address any legal questions about the inheritance. The setting felt symbolically appropriate, the family gathering in the house that now belonged to me, discussing their future in space that was mine to control. The Blackwood family assembled, in the formal living room where I had endured so many awkward conversations over the years. But this time, I sat in Evelyn's chair, the place of honor that had always been reserved for the family matriarch. The role reversal was subtle but unmistakable to everyone present. Victoria entered with her usual commanding presence, though I noticed signs of strain in her perfectly maintained appearance. The week of uncertainty about her financial future had clearly taken a toll on her confidence. Robert followed with his characteristic businesslike demeanor, carrying a legal folder that suggested he had been researching options for challenging the inheritance. Marcus and Catherine arrived together, both wearing expressions of carefully controlled hope that suggested they had spent considerable time planning their approach to this conversation. Trevor and Sophia trailed behind their parents, looking like they were attending a funeral for their trust fund expectations. Margaret was the last to arrive, settling into a chair near mine with the satisfied expression of someone who had been waiting years for this family reckoning to finally occur. "Emma," Victoria began without preamble, "I think we need to discuss how to handle this inheritance situation in a way that preserves family unity and honors Mother Blackwood's true intentions." The assumption that she understood Evelyn's intentions better than the woman who had received detailed written explanations was breathtaking in its audacity. Victoria was still trying to position herself as the authority on family matters despite having just learned that she had fundamentally misunderstood our family structure for 3 years. "Actually," I replied calmly, "I think we need to discuss how you're going to handle the fact that your behavior toward me has been completely unacceptable, and that this inheritance doesn't change my expectations about being treated with basic respect." Robert leaned forward with his practiced negotiation posture. "Emma, I think we're all still adjusting to this unexpected situation. Perhaps we could focus on practical matters rather than rehashing past misunderstandings." "Past misunderstandings?" I repeated, my voice carrying enough edge to make several family members shift uncomfortably. Is that what you call 3 years of condescension, dismissal, and outright hostility? Is that what you call your wife looking me in the eye and calling me worthless? Victoria's face flushed, but she maintained her defensive posture. That was an emotional moment during a very stressful evening. I think you're being overly sensitive about comments that were taken out of context. The absolute refusal to acknowledge responsibility or show genuine remorse confirmed everything I had suspected about her character. Victoria was more concerned about maintaining her position than addressing the damage her behavior had caused. "Let me be very clear about something," I said, looking around the room at faces that were finally forced to take me seriously. "This inheritance doesn't make me desperate for your acceptance anymore. It gives me the freedom to choose my relationships based on how people actually treat me rather than how much I need their approval." Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "Emma, we're family. Surely we can move past these interpersonal issues and focus on what's best for everyone involved." "Family," I repeated thoughtfully. "For 3 years you've made it clear that being married to David didn't make me real family. You've excluded me from conversations, dismissed my background, and treated me like hired help at formal gatherings. Now you want to claim family loyalty when it benefits your financial interests." Catherine attempted a different approach, using her museum curator voice to sound reasonable and cultural. "I think we all recognize that emotions have been running high, but surely you can see that maintaining family connections serves everyone's interests, especially yours. Managing substantial wealth requires advice and support from people who understand your situation." The suggestion that I needed their guidance to handle my inheritance was particularly rich, coming from people who had just discovered they understood far less about our family situation than they had assumed. Catherine was still trying to position herself as the sophisticated family member who could educate me about upper-class responsibilities. "I have excellent legal and financial advisors," I replied. "What I need from family members is genuine respect and authentic relationship, not calculated attempts to access my resources while maintaining condescending attitudes about my background and capabilities." The room fell silent as the family absorbed the reality that their future comfort depended entirely on my willingness to maintain relationships with people who had spent years making me feel unwelcome. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that their previous strategies for managing me were not just ineffective, but counterproductive. Margaret broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "What do you want from them, Emma? What would it take for you to consider rebuilding these relationships?" I had been thinking about this question all week, trying to balance my desire for justice with my recognition that healthy relationships required some possibility of redemption. I want genuine acknowledgement of how I've been treated, not minimization or excuses. I want changed behavior going forward, not promises about trying harder. And I want respect for my decisions about how to use this inheritance, not pressure to conform to your expectations about appropriate charitable giving or family obligations. Victoria's expression suggested that meeting these requirements would be almost physically painful for her. Acknowledging her behavior would require admitting that her entire approach to social hierarchy had been wrong, that her efforts to exclude me had been based on prejudices rather than legitimate family protection. Robert attempted to negotiate from his business perspective. "What about a formal agreement? Clear expectations about family interactions? Defined boundaries about financial discussions? Structured approach to rebuilding trust over time?" The idea of treating our family relationships like a business contract was both absurd and somehow fitting, given their transactional approach to most personal connections. "I'm not interested in contracts," I said. "I'm interested in genuine change in attitudes and behavior. Either you're capable of treating me with respect because it's the right thing to do, or you're not." David spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice carrying new authority. "I think what Emma is saying is that the inheritance doesn't create new obligations for her. It reveals who people really are when the power dynamic changes. Some relationships might be worth rebuilding, and others might not. His support felt both welcome and overdue. David was finally taking a clear position in conflicts that had been damaging our marriage for years, choosing my dignity over family harmony in a way he had never been able to do before. Sophia, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, surprised everyone by speaking up. "I think you all owe Emma an apology. I'm 21 years old, and even I could see how awful you've been to her at family dinners. The inheritance doesn't change that you were wrong about how you treated her." The moral clarity from the youngest family member highlighted how obviously inappropriate the family's behavior had been. If a college student could recognize the problem, the adults certainly should have been capable of better choices. Trevor nodded agreement with his sister. "Yeah, it was pretty messed up. And now you're all acting like she should just forget about it because the money situation changed. That's not how relationships work." The generational divide in the family's reaction was striking. The younger members seemed more capable of recognizing their elders' mistakes and adjusting their own behavior accordingly. The older generation remained committed to defending their previous actions rather than acknowledging error. Victoria made one final attempt to assert control over the situation. "I think you're all forgetting that family loyalty requires forgiveness and understanding from everyone involved. Emma may have legitimate grievances, but continuing to hold grudges serves no one's interests." The attempt to frame my desire for accountability as unreasonable grudge holding was exactly the kind of manipulation I had been subjected to for years. Victoria was still trying to make me responsible for fixing relationships that had been damaged by other people's choices. "Forgiveness isn't the same as pretending that behavior doesn't have consequences," I replied. "You've had 3 years to treat me with basic respect, and you chose not to. The inheritance doesn't erase that history or create obligations for me to ignore it." Sandra Hamilton, who had been observing the family dynamics with professional interest, finally spoke up. "Perhaps this would be a good time to review the practical implications of Mrs. Blackwood's will. The inheritance comes with no requirements for Emma to maintain specific family relationships or provide financial support to other family members. These are personal decisions that she's free to make based on her own judgment." The legal confirmation that I owed them nothing financially or socially seemed to deflate some of the family's remaining hope that they could pressure me into maintaining previous relationship patterns. They would have to earn my continued involvement in their lives rather than assuming it was automatically guaranteed. As the meeting drew to a close, I made my position clear. I'm willing to give people chances to rebuild our relationships based on changed behavior. But I'm not interested in pretending that past treatment didn't matter or accepting promises about future improvement without evidence of actual change. Some of you may prove capable of growth, and others may not. The family left Willowbrook that afternoon with a clear understanding that their futures depended entirely on their ability to transform attitudes and behaviors that had shaped their interactions for decades. Some of them might prove capable of such fundamental change, while others would likely choose to maintain their prejudices at the cost of family connection. 6 months later, the results of that ultimatum had become clear. Victoria and Robert had made minimal efforts to modify their behavior, offering surface-level apologies that failed to address their underlying attitudes about class and social hierarchy. Our interactions remained cordial but distant, limited to necessary communication about practical matters related to the estate. Marcus and Catherine had initially attempted to rebuild relationships, while simultaneously positioning themselves to benefit from foundation grants and charitable giving. When I made it clear that personal relationships and professional opportunities would be kept completely separate, they lost interest in sustained effort to repair family connections. The younger generation had surprised me with their adaptability and genuine remorse. Trevor and Sophia had both apologized sincerely for their previous behavior and had made obvious efforts to educate themselves about privilege and social justice. They had become regular volunteers at the foundation I established, contributing their time and energy without any expectation of financial benefit. David had followed through on his commitment to rebuild our marriage on more authentic foundations. He had taken the position with the district attorney's office and was pursuing cases involving corporate fraud and white-collar crime with genuine passion. Our relationship had grown stronger as we learned to support each other's values rather than manage conflicting family loyalties. Margaret had become my closest ally and advisor, sharing wisdom gained from decades of observing family dynamics while maintaining her own independent perspective. Her friendship provided connection to my heritage without the complications of inherited resentment or calculated positioning. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment about relationships and worthiness. The inheritance had given me financial freedom, but more importantly, it had given me permission to value myself according to my own standards rather than other people's approval. I was no longer trying to earn acceptance from people who had revealed themselves to be fundamentally committed to exclusion and hierarchy. The foundation I established in Evelyn's honor had grown into a substantial program supporting first-generation college students, providing mentorship, financial assistance, and advocacy for young people navigating systems that weren't designed with their success in mind. The work was deeply fulfilling in ways that managing inherited wealth for its own sake never could have been. Willowbrook Estate had been transformed from a monument to exclusivity into a space for inclusion and opportunity. The formal dining room where Victoria had called me worthless now hosted scholarship award dinners for students who understood the value of education because they had worked hard to achieve it. The living room where family members had dismissed my professional work had become a meeting space for nonprofit organizations addressing social justice issues. Every day brought reminders that worth wasn't determined by bloodlines, bank accounts, or social acceptance, but by the choices we made about how to treat others and what values to prioritize in our daily lives. The inheritance had given me resources, but my true wealth had always been my commitment to authenticity, kindness, and justice. Standing in Evelyn's study one evening, surrounded by photographs and letters that documented decades of secret love and delayed recognition, I finally understood what my great-grandmother had really left me. Not just money, but the freedom to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, to support causes that reflected my values rather than social expectations, and to define my own worth rather than seeking validation from people who were committed to finding me inadequate. The girl who had grown up in her parents' restaurant, earned her education through scholarships and determination, and built her career helping others navigate systemic obstacles, had always been valuable. The inheritance hadn't made me worthy. It had simply given me the power to ensure that other people's recognition of my worth was no longer necessary for my happiness or success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.